Hi, this is Dave. Wanted to let you know that we are taking a break for July 4th and there will be no new episode on Tuesday, July 1st. Then, we'll be back on July 8th with a special episode, and later in July, we'll have senior editor Tom Holler from Random House as well as author Eric Clayton. If you're enjoying What Does Star Wars Mean to You, please give us a 5-star rating and a glowing review because it really helps get the word out there. So again, no new episode July 1st, but then we'll be back on July 8th for more What Does Star Wars Mean to You? Until then, may the Force be with you.
And I think I end up calling Star Wars a cultural weather vane because it shows you the direction of the wind in America. In American politics, It shows you what is concerning America more than anything else in pop culture.
Hello there, this is Dave and I'm an original trilogy kid.
And this is Elora, I'm a prequel trilogy kid. Welcome to the show where we talk to all kinds of fans of the franchise, one person at a time, to find out what does Star Wars mean to you.
And today we're doing something a little bit different. After watching the fantastic series Andor, where the tactics of the rising fascist empire felt eerily like a reflection of our own world, we wanted to kind of dive into that some more, so we invited an author who wrote the book on the Empire 2 times. First, The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire, that gives the in-universe history of the Empire, as well as a book that looks at how Star Wars reflects the real world rise of fascism. The history and politics of Star Wars, Death Stars and Democracies. He's been on the show before, and we found out what does Star Wars mean to him. So please give a warm hello there to Dr. Chris Kemphsall.
Hello there.
Hello there. I'm back
to
talk about all of my funniest books, all of my most uplifting, heartwarming writing.
You need to write next, and Lucasfilm, if you're listening, you're going to want to jump on this. Chicken soup for the Sith soul.
Yeah.
Or chicken soup for the Sith.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, 100%, particularly if they have a pronounced chicken allergy. Feels like a real easy way of clearing a lot of those troubles right up.
Exactly. The first thing I do want to mention is this book came out 1 month before the premiere of Andor Season 1 on Disney+. But there's a quote from the book here that I think is extremely relevant to Andor, and it's just to go to show how history does link to Star Wars. And you wrote, to acquire these precious resources, the Empire would often, like its previous expanded universe incarnation, resort to planetary genocide. And I think that represents exactly what happens in Andor Season 2 with the Gorman Massacre. So to say that this book came out before Andor doesn't mean you don't touch on the same kind of things that Andor does. And I think that's part of why we wanted to dive into it at this particular stage in the Star Wars evolution.
Yeah, I think do you know the guy on Ferrix who does with the hammers, who does the marking of the time? Yeah. That's eerily, it turns out, very similar to the noise my head made on the table watching the first season of Andor come out a month after my book had. And realizing all the stuff I missed out on putting in, although it would have made the book an awful lot longer. But it's like, oh, come on, guys, really?
I honestly feel like the Andor aspect of it is kind of one aspect of your book. Like, it could be a sequel to your book just on Andor and the history of the world within Star Wars and Andor.
Yeah, it absolutely could. Although it's a weird one because like various people have kind of said after Andor came out, oh, you should go back and revisit history and politics. I was like, I don't know if I can. I don't know, now that I've jumped to the fence, like intellectually and ethically, if I release, more history, more politics of Star Wars, Tokyo Drift. And I'm going, like, there's loads and loads of history and politics in Star Wars, and the audience are going to be like, yeah, loads of it, if we look at the footnotes, are you, Chris. You can't write a book and just cite yourself and go, wow, look, there's some stuff in Star Wars. Academically, that's really quite dubious. And then I'll also probably get like a phone call from Lucasfilm going, was this the plan all along? Because you don't need to worry about the next one because it isn't going to happen. So I think I almost have to kind of like bequeath that aspect of like academic Star Wars studies to somebody else now to kind of to Andor the field somewhat.
I do think that the book, The History and Politics of Star Wars, does really touch upon everything it needs to touch upon without Andor. I think Andor's just the proof in the pudding.
Yeah, it would have been more worrying if Andor had contradicted the book massively, but the fact that it actually works kind of fine anyway, it's like, wow, no, I was just a genius, it's fine.
Well, I think it's interesting. You end the book by talking about how Star Wars speaks in reference points and languages that we understand because of all of these reference points in history, and that, you know, it's kind of a commentary on who we are as humanity and in our people's history, and that when it speaks in the future, that it's going to have to draw from the past. But what's interesting with Andor is it's very much, I feel, speaking a bit in the present.
Yeah.
Like, what's your reflection on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one because Andor exists at various different times. You know, it exists at the period when they wrote it, it exists at the period when they filmed it, and it exists at the period when the audience watches it.
Yeah.
And that's true of all creative endeavors, and it's very, very true of Star Wars. That, you know, sometimes we watch something or we get something else out of it because of something that's happening in our world at the moment that wasn't necessarily intended, but works very, very well alongside it.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that as well with the prequel trilogy. You know, the periods of times when you actually sit down and watch it influences what you take from it.
Yes.
So there's definitely things, you know, even when they were, I think when they were working on Andor, I think there was like quotes from Tony Gilroy and that talking about, you know, reacting to like a Trump America scenario for the first season and the like. And again you get a slightly more of that in the second season, again partly because our real world has changed around it. But then in like the first episode of the second season of Andor, Tony Gilroy drops the Vanessay conference straight into like almost exactly into the middle of Star Wars with a bunch of space Nazis sitting around deciding how they're going to perpetuate something absolutely awful.
Right.
Go,
Yes.
oh, okay, so we're just, you know, there's not even any subtext here. You're just doing it on the screen.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. Andor season 2 definitely had that aspect of like, here's the French rebellion. Here's the here are truly the Nazis sitting around.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's sometimes a feeling of, when I was writing history and politics, and I was consuming a bunch of stuff, there's sometimes an element of like, am I actually, it's you know, that workman with a hammer views every problem as a nail, you know, it's historian with a bunch of Star Wars stuff. Is it like, am I just reading too much into this? And then you watch Andor, I go, you know what, I think I'm just on the nose, actually, with this. I think I'm reading exactly what Tony Gilroy wants me to read into this.
Yeah. And I think there is a kind of dividing line, and it's a very thin line between the author or creator's intention and the audience reaction to it.
Yes.
And there may be specific things that the author intends or does not intend that do come through because of how people are living their lives and viewing that product as 100%. It is now.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, there's always like kind of that, sometimes you get it in like literary studies, the idea of the death of the author, that it doesn't actually matter what Mary Shelley thought she was writing when she wrote Frankenstein. It matters what the audience takes from it. And, you know, it doesn't necessarily matter what I feel when I write anything. It matters what the audience takes from it. And Star Wars is very prone to that actually you can watch Star Wars and disregard George Lucas's intentions and take something very interesting and very different from it. And you can do that with Andor, and you can do it with the expanded universe novels and the like. But at the same time, it is also important to kind of recognize that there's something underneath that's driving this stuff. They're not just pulling it out of thin air to create something in space.
Absolutely agree. And one thing I really enjoyed about the book, reading it's because I haven't visited the expanded universe. Through the 90s and early 2000s, I lived it. I bought every book that came out, just read everything I possibly could, watched everything I possibly could. And what I enjoyed about this was it was a little bit of a refresher of those storylines, because I was coming back to characters and scenes that I hadn't thought about in like 20 or 30 years.
Oh, wow.
Oof. It's sort of like, yeah, I know. You're sitting there going, yeah, that's how old I am. Whatever, youngie.
I do have Attack of the Clones on my wall. No. Okay.
But it kind of gives you that refresher of the expanded universe from Timothy Zahn all the way up to like the prequel trilogy and a little beyond. How did you kind of like wade through all of that. That like just that amount of work, because you do touch upon comics, you do touch upon books, and there's a lot.
Yeah. So there's varying different aspects to this. The intellectual one is that, there is a field of Star Wars studies, that people who study Star Wars as a cultural thing, as a media thing, as a historical thing, and quite often they tend to focus on the films, or previously it focused on the film before Disney Plus expanded it in a different kind of television way. And the reason for that is completely understandable. This is not a criticism at all. It's that it's an awful lot easier to watch a film than it is to go away and read 200 novels.
Yes,
it takes a great deal less time. And it's also the way that the majority of the audience of people interact with Star Wars. That you only have to go to Star Wars celebrations. And I love my book reading comrades. The book readers are a subset of the Star Wars audience. Most people's interaction of it is with the film. So it makes absolute perfect sense to focus on the films. But it didn't make perfect sense for me to focus on the films, because if you're going to talk about how Star Wars tells stories based on history, real world history and real world politics, you have to talk about the lot. And the films, whilst making up the majority of the audience interaction, are the minority of Star Wars storytelling by a metrics of tons of material is not in the films, appears in the books or the comics or the computer games or whatever. So for me to do it properly, I knew I had to spread as wide a net as possible. Now, the benefit for me was that whilst for, any ordinary, reasonable human being undertaking a study, going, okay, you have to go away and read these 200 novels, that's an ask for them, unless they'd wasted their life already doing so. At which case, it becomes less of a problem for them.
Yes.
Because if I'm writing First World War history, my normal stuff, and I was like, oh God, I need a thing. I need to go to the Imperial War Museum. Oh God, now I've got to go to Paris, and I've got to go to this archive, or I've got to get the funds to go to America. This is going to take ages, and it's going to be a real pain. For me doing this, I went upstairs. And I took whatever novel I required off of the bookshelf where it had been living since the 2000s and the 1990s. And I had it all there already. And I've got a very weird memory in that I remember odd things. I remembered most of the plot lines. And if there was something that I was thinking of, I could generally remember which page it was on, not necessarily the number, if it's on the left-hand page or the right-hand page, because I'd read these things to death over the late 1990s and the early 2000s. The problem for me came when talking to my editors at Routledge for it, and they were like, you understand that you might have to do a big recap in the introduction of the major plot points of the expanded universe. I was like, I do realize that, but do you realize that Pablo Hidalgo released a book called The Essential Reader's Companion that's 400 pages long, which is a recap of the major plot points of the Star Wars expanded universe. And I don't have 400 pages to do that in. I probably have 4.
Yeah.
So how we're gonna cram this in. But in cramming it in and putting that overview in, part of the motivation was to help the field of Star Wars studies. That again, no one else is going to go and read 200 novels, but Star Wars studies and historians need to interact with the expanded universe. They have to. It's super, super important. So to an extent, I'm hoping that recap means that they don't have to go and read 200 novels. They can pick out the bits that they like from that bit and the rest of the book and go, actually, if I'm just super interested in politics in the late 1990s, these are just the books I need to read because it's already been spelled out for me that these are the books I need to read. So part of it was like, okay, for the rest of the field, I'm only doing this once. I will give you a little present, but you guys have to interact with the expanded universe. This is the only way this is going to work. I'm not just going to do this for my own sake. The rest of you then have to keep up your side of the bargain.
Well, one of the things I think the books help, not just your argument, but it helps to flesh out the relationship between our world and the Star Wars world. Because I do believe that the films are almost outlines and shorthand when it comes to that. And it's in there, but when you have to cover not just, the 3 years where the original, or the 6 years where the original trilogy takes place in universe, but in the expanded universe, the 40 years that come after, and then in the Disney canon, the 20 or 25 years that come after. I think your book does a great job of also not just having that recap at the top, but when you reference back to things in history and tie it to something specific in one of the stories, whether it's the fall of Russia, the 9/11 terrorist attacks, all these things are represented, and it really lines up with the release dates of these books. I think, and so as someone who was very distant from those books, I felt as though I could easily jump in and understand your story of Star Wars today.
Well, that's a relief. I'll let the publisher.
Yes.
Good work, everybody.
I could tell you were sweating. Like, did Dave get this? I know he's a dummy, but did he get it? I got it.
Because one of the things I kind of say in the book is that Star Wars is trying to talk to us. Like, everybody involved in creating, from George Lucas down to the Timothy Zahn, Kevin J. Anderson, all of these guys in the 1990s, they're trying to talk to us, and they use references that are interesting to them, and they try and use language that they think the rest of them are going to get. And all we have to do is kind of understand what it is that they're trying to talk to us about. And it doesn't just stop when Return of the Jedi rolls, or when Timothy Zahn stops with Last Command. And all of these things exist. And I think I end up calling Star Wars a cultural weather vane, because it shows you the direction of the wind in America, in American politics. It shows you what is concerning America more than anything else in pop culture. And the lines between the films and the books blur a lot in people's minds. Now, this isn't a kind of like a criticism. People can like and dislike whatever they like. But I found it really interesting that a lot of the critique of The Last Jedi about Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi was that he should have been like this all-powerful, force-using badass. He should have been coming out and doing all the stuff. That version of Luke never appears in any of the Star Wars films at all. It just doesn't exist, but he appears a lot in the expanded universe and in the comics. That's the Luke Skywalker who exists in the 1990s and the early 2000s, but he never appears on screen or anything like that. And I found that a really interesting level, to the extent to which the entire kind of Star Wars canon has blurred, that I don't know if people were aware of the fact that they weren't remembering anything that happened in the films. It just isn't there.
Yeah.
It's absolutely true that it's almost like people took their own expectations of what Luke should be after defeating the Emperor and Darth Vader and projected that onto the Last Jedi screen, as opposed
reinforced by these novels from the 1990s where Luke can do all of this stuff and does it all the time.
Yeah, and I think especially of I forget what it was called. It came out in like 92. Dark Empire. Dark Empire, he was like that kind of uber powerful.
Yeah, and there's an argument like, I don't know if that version of Luke is a version of Luke that I recognise either. Based off
I
of
agree.
Return of the Jedi, but that was the version that existed in that time period.
Sorry, I'm like, yeah.
So, Elora, you need to go and read 200 novels.
Well, that's kind of where I was going with this. Like, that's kind of what I gathered most. Especially doing this podcast, speaking to so many really cool creatives in the Star Wars, fandom and creation of new stories, and especially like your work, Chris, and kind of like the history, the tie-in, and the politics of it all. Just how much, especially as like a prequel trilogy kid, like subliminal messaging that I didn't appreciate for what it is until I was, a grown woman and able to kind of look back on it and say like, oh, like this is a commentary on this. And I feel like I am being taken to school right now. So
I honestly,
in the best possible way. Yeah.
None of us should feel bad about it. And it's one of the really interesting things about the idea that politics have never been in Star Wars is heavily dependent on the fact that people watched them when they were children. It's like when I watched A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi in the 1980s as a child, I didn't then go, turn them off and walk into the kitchen and go, Mother, Father, I think we need to have a conversation about the Vietnam War. Partly because, the Vietnam War had been over for quite some time, but also I was a child and therefore an idiot. And I didn't pick up on all of this stuff Because it was a space pew pew laser film, and it's fine if that's what you get from it when you're a child, but it doesn't mean that stuff isn't in there.
Yeah.
And as we get older and we begin to understand what it was that George Lucas was trying to say, and it's very overt about what it was that he was trying to say,
Absolutely.
doesn't change the fact that it was okay to not get it when you were younger, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't there when you're older.
Yeah.
Do you think Tony Gilroy with Andor was more overt than Lucas with the original trilogy?
It's a really difficult question for me to answer. Yet maybe in his own way, partly because he has more time. He has more space.
Yes.
Andor is a lot longer. The 2 seasons is a lot longer than the original trilogy is. He's got room to put a lot of politics in there.
That's true.
That George Lucas doesn't have time for with the original trilogy. And in that sense, he is quite overt about stuff. But I'm watching it now, and I'm going to be 42 years old in later this year. I'm not watching it as a 9-year-old or as an English 9-year-old as well, where the Vietnam War stuff it has no place really in our pop culture in the 1970s and the 80s outside of American politics and American war films and stuff like that. So that was also one of the interesting things about reading stuff again when I was trying to do the book, is that I'm still English. Like, there must be loads of American stuff in there I'm just not getting because it doesn't exist for me. There's no reference point for it. But George Lucas called them stormtroopers, and he dressed them up as in kind of Nazi-esque uniforms, and like in his own way, he's pretty overt about what it is that he's trying to say. And there's all sorts of holes that you could pick in it, and there's to greater or lesser extent there's a point to doing that, and there's no point in doing it at all.
Yeah.
I think in the time and the place of the 1970s, George Lucas felt he was as overt as he could be, or that he needed to be. That doesn't take away from the fact that he was annoyed that people didn't get it.
Yes. I think that's a big point of clarification, almost that just because he did it doesn't mean people got it. And I think they got caught up in the serial and action adventure of it.
Well,
and the special effects.
Like before. Oh, so we all talked over each other.
Good luck on that edit. I have in my mind this picture of George Lucas like sat at the back of a cinema and everybody coming out of like Man's Chinese Theatre in 1977 going, and all the crowd going, what a great pew pew film, and I love the lightsabers and I love the stuff, and George Lucas going, but what about the Vietnam War? Why aren't you as worried about any of this as I am? Why aren't you people not getting it? I'm being really annoyed that no one's getting the subtext or the context
my
of
warning here.
Yeah. And if you listen to George Lucas's interviews as the years go by, I don't think that level of annoyance goes down. I think it actually goes up.
I agree, because I feel like he gets more and more pointed, or like, no, this is what I was saying, and this is what this means, as opposed to being like, well, it's up to interpretation.
Yeah, he does interviews after the prequel trilogy come out. And he's like, I get criticised loads about why was there this boring politics and trade stuff in the Phantom Menace? Why wasn't it exciting? He was like, well, because boring politics and trade stuff is how wars eventually start. And then you look around now and go, yeah, good call, George.
It's been a funny like trending thing on like a meme on TikTok. I don't know if that's been across your algorithm, but all the prequel trilogy kids, sitting like they're like sitting on the couch as children, like, oh, like how would a trade war start a galactic? And then they're like adults, like, oh, that's how.
And I think I describe George Lucas as having like a pop history version of history, because I never want to, and it feels incredibly churlish, and people shouldn't do it, criticize George Lucas for getting his history wrong. And he does get his history wrong at various points. He tells stories about stuff that just doesn't happen or isn't true. But
well, from a certain point of view.
But what he's trying to do is interact with history as somebody who isn't a historian, and he tries to tell popularly understood versions of history which may or may not be true as he understands them. And it's fine if he's wrong on those things, because he's not pretending to be a historian. And sometimes he's right and sometimes he's wrong, but he's trying to tell broader stories about how he understands history.
Yes. And also, I think a little bit take that history and reflect it into the future of what could be. Because one of the things he's always talking about is it's like poetry, they rhyme.
Yes.
And I wonder, after reading your book, I was like, oh, not only does poetry rhyme, but so does history.
Yes.
And so, not a real question there. I apologize, Chris. It's just as an observation of that you're on top of this in your book.
Yeah, there's I think it's a James Joyce quote saying that there is no such thing as the present or the future. There is only the past happening now, today.
Oh, wow.
And whilst I don't fully buy into, and this is nobody listening, none of you need to care about this. It's just stupid academic historian nonsense. I don't fully buy into the point of the idea that history constantly repeats itself, and or that it's linear, or all of these aspects. But you do get historical trends, and you do get things that reemerge and happen in particular ways that coexist or correspond to things that have happened in the past. The idea that historians are also fortune tellers is a problematic one for me, because I would be a richer man if that was true, and a better historian if that was true. I do think that it's a popularly understood thing, and again, I have slight issues with, but that's irrelevant and nonsense. That you learn the lessons of the past so you don't repeat them in the future. The degree to which that is true or not true, shrug, who cares? But it's not a bad starting point for a society, and it's certainly not a bad narrative starting point if you want to tell an interesting story about the types of things that concern you in the world.
Yeah. One of the things that concerns me in the world is fascism. And even though I can't say the word, I fear it.
What a segue.
I was like, I am going to put my sneakers on and turn on a dime. But one of my big questions has always been, and I'm so glad you're here to ask these kind of questions. Why are fascists so keen on branding? Is that something that's unique to the Nazi regime? Is it a form of propaganda?
I think it's all of the above. And this is going to sound like, I have no interest in being fair to fascists, but they're not alone in being interested in branding. Stalin creates a cult of personality around himself, and some of this is kind of also emergence of modern media as we would recognize it.
Totally.
Newspapers, radio, film, printing presses, and they're like, allow for this type of thing. So, and Napoleon liked having pictures of himself painted because, ego equals branding quite often. But the fascist movement exists in like an interesting duality, that it has two audiences at the same time, and both of them need to be reached by branding. You have the audience of, we want to get you guys on side, fascism, sign up here. And the way you do that is by being everywhere, being visibly everywhere in a recognizable way that gets to the point that you don't have to explain what the movement is. Just being able to, the symbols alone should be enough to fill in a lot of the blanks for people. And, whilst you'll give speeches suggesting solutions and there are problems, you can leave some of that vague enough to be unsaid, but also entirely understandable by everybody who's listening to the speech. So the branding exists to an extent to bring people on side, almost to make people feel like there are more of them around than there might necessarily be. The Nazis never win an election in Germany. People don't vote for them in enough numbers to ever win an election, but they make it feel like there's a lot of them. And then the other audience is the people you want to terrify. And the branding works just as well on them as well. You need to make them feel that there are a lot more of you than there are of them, that, you need them to understand the messages. And those two things exist very, very happily side by side within fascist states and fascist organizations, that the message is to both divide and conquer at the same time. As things go on and kind of more power is achieved, you have to increase the messaging, because fascists are bad at their jobs. It turns out that they are not good at, none of these guys are geniuses. None of these guys are brilliant at running things and doing stuff. The example I always used to give to my students, Heinrich Himmler is a failed chicken farmer. Do you know how hard it is to fail at being a chicken? chickens produce themselves
Chickens.
regularly. You don't have to do anything to farm chickens. They will produce eggs of their own accord.
Wow.
That's how bad these guys are at virtually everything, except it turns out killing lots of people. That they were great at. Turns out they were very good at the worst things in the world. But they're not geniuses. And the way that you mask up for the fact that actually none of you are particularly good at your job is you increase the branding, you increase the message, you increase the propaganda, you increase the noise, you increase the stuff up until the point when it reaches critical mass and the wheels start coming off. Historically, that's a not a bad way of looking at a state like Nazi Germany.
Wow.
Yeah, that's incredible. I never thought of it as being two sides of the same coin almost. The conquer and the get on board.
Yeah.
That's terrifying, actually.
Yeah, you speak to both sides of the street at the same time and make it clear which side of the street you either want them to be on or the side of the street they're not going to be able to exist on anymore.
Kind of adjacent to this, you wrote that for Lucas, the collapse of the Republic into the Empire and fascism was aligned with the idea that, like, democracies aren't overthrown, but, like, handed away, like, given over. I'm wondering for you, like, what lessons should the audience draw from the fact that the Republic didn't fall through force, but through this kind of manipulation that I think we're circling here?
Yeah, it's possible that George Lucas has a more cynical view of democracy than I do, and I'm living in 2025. But it never works in Star Wars at all, on any level. It never appears to work, whether it's in the prequel trilogy, whether it's in the expanded universe, in any of it. It never appears to fully function. And I think, because George Lucas is drawing on very particular examples, he's talking about Caesar with the Roman Republic, he's talking about Napoleon and the French Revolution, he's talking about Hitler with the Weimar Republic in Germany. And those are decent examples of power being given to people in a time of crisis who then are like, you can give it to me, you can trust me. I, Napoleon Bonaparte, are a renowned, trustworthy guy. I learned everything that I needed to from Julius Caesar, who's also a renowned, trustworthy guy. Is that people tend to think that the collapses of democratic states is more dramatic than it is. And I wonder whether or not that is partially a reference to Hollywood, that we tend to think in Hollywood moments for big events and history and big stuff. Is, you know, it's a fanfare, it's an explosion, it's the soaring music of John Williams, it's the audio-visual experience, when actually it's often about decay and erosion and decomposition, and it happens in increments. And you can look at the things that George Lucas says about democracy, and you can look at the prequel trilogy, and you can see that that's the type of thing that concerns him, that you lose democracy by increments. It's an inch a day. It's the tectonic plates of collapse. And that by the time you get to a point of Revenge of the Sith with Order 66, and we do get our big cinematic moment, but that's not the end of the Republic. The Republic was gone way before the Jedi Temple's on fire and Palpatine's face has melted. It's happened he doesn't need to shoot lightning from his hands to collapse the Republic. He's already done it. And I think it's a very interesting way of looking at the Republic in Star Wars. It is a very interesting way of looking at democratic institutions in the real world, that, you know, they do fall over time. It's the idea that democracy isn't a spectator sport. You know, you participate or you don't. And if you participate, you have to participate today, and you have to participate tomorrow, and you have to participate the day afterwards. Because at some point, the day you don't participate will be the day that the Sith participate on your behalf, or the Empire participates on your behalf, or Napoleon participates on your behalf, or Hitler participates on your behalf. And I think that's how George Lucas looks at democracy, and it's a really interesting way of looking at it.
I think it's a really vital way of looking at it.
Yeah. You either join in or you don't. But the people who are not interested in democracy succeeding in Star Wars or in the real world will participate at the moments that they believe that their participation will matter the most.
I mean, jump
such an
here.
uplifting guest. I love coming on and being so optimistic to everybody.
This is what people need to hear. This is such an important. I wholeheartedly believe this. Like, this is such an important conversation. But I just cut off Dave's thought.
No, it's totally okay because my thoughts written down. I think, again, adjacent to this is that you wrote that the desire to avoid conflict prevented this democracy from doing what would appear to be morally right. Do you see real-world democracies exhibiting this same pattern today?
Oh, God, all the time. And, I'm a First World War historian, so, that's my background. The lead up to the Second World War is a story of appeasement. The Western powers, Britain, France, and America in particular, are so exhausted and terrified of fighting another war like the awful one that they've just done, they will go to really great lengths and extents to avoid it. Now, on the surface, that's not the worst motivation in the world. We don't want to fight a war. We will do everything we can within our power to preserve peace. Put that on the side of like a billboard, and it's a very difficult thing to argue against.
Yeah.
The problem is it suggests everybody else is acting in good faith. And the Nazis, it turns out, not big good faith havers in the 1930s. And rather than getting to the point of going, you have breached the Treaty of Versailles so egregiously over and over and over again, the only option left to us is to enforce this upon you. They don't. And they give stuff away. They give Austria away, they give Czechoslovakia away, and eventually, it's Poland. And it turns out Hitler isn't satisfied with all of these things. And you see it in that time period, and you see it. It's fascinating to me how moments like the Rwandan genocide of the 1990s and the Srebrenica massacre of the 1990s, which were Srebrenica massacre bigger news than the Rwandan genocide, which in its own way is horrifying, that the Rwandan genocide was not on the news every single night when it was happening, until people realised what was happening, are represented in the Star Wars universe as tales of the New Republic looking at something that they should intervene with and going, our peace is more important than your suffering is. And it's a direct critique of the UN, and it's a direct critique of the United States in that time period of going, if we do this, if we get involved, the spectres of Vietnam will rise up around us and people will criticize us for doing it. And therefore, our peace is more important than stopping your genocide. And you see it in the 90s, and you see it now. The events going on in the world that people choose and do not choose to get involved in are often motivated by geopolitical self-interest. And, as distasteful as it is, that's a reality, kids. I hate it, but we live in the world that we live in. And you only have to compare the Ukraine conflict with what's happening in Gaza to get a real, very clear view about what people care about in the world and what they don't care about in the world. And therefore, what they will intervene with and the extent to which they will intervene and what they will not intervene with. And, it's awful. It's horrible. And I struggle, I struggled for years trying to teach history to students at university whilst living through the world we live in a sense of trying to make it like any of this mattered. Because clearly it doesn't. In the ways that I want it to matter, it turns out no one cares. And we thought we had a real good, easy message of explaining this stuff to people. We've been doing it for years, and it turned out, nope, we were way off, and no one appears to care about this in the way that we want them to. Certainly not in the halls of power. So you can absolutely see that particular as a thing that rhymes and reproduces. Go all the way back to the 1920s and the 1930s, or just, open Twitter or the news today and help yourself.
Wow.
You have so many great bon mots, like the giving, you give your, Hitler will choose for you, Napoleon will choose for you. I thought that was great. And then go to the 1930s or open Twitter. What a great way to kind of condense the concept of how, like you said, rhymes and reproduces.
I mean, also for everybody's own, benefit, don't open Twitter. Just
Yes.
do yourself a solid and don't open Twitter.
We've talked a lot about the doom and gloom.
So now we're moving on to the jokes. Two Sith Lords walk into a bar.
Yes, that was just good.
What is this, some kind of prophecy?
Oh, that's amazing. I kind of wanted to touch on. I want to shift gears a little bit and touch on kind of the idea of this like rebellion into revolution, and the way I wanted to kind of ask you about that. Any excuse to talk about Leia as a character. And you mentioned that she kind of embodies that shift between rebellion to revolution.
Yes.
And so I thought maybe I'd ask if you could talk about what distinguishes a revolutionary from a rebel to you, and how Leia embodied that.
It's a great question. It's a really, really good question, and I'm always more than happy to talk about Leia. So, the Rebel Alliance, as portrayed on film, has literally no ideology attached to it at all, except for presumably wanting to bring back the Republic.
Yeah.
Which, Republic versus Empire. Republic sounds better, but that's not a revolution. There's very good books, all of which I cannot immediately remember off the top of my head. I think there's one called The Empire Triumphant, which is a book that I cite a lot, that I think refers to the conservative nature of the Rebel Alliance, in that they want to bring back that which had existed before because the past was better, which is a really interesting way of looking at the Rebel Alliance. I don't think that's what Princess Leia wants. Princess Leia wants a revolution. She wants something new that is better than both of the two things that came beforehand. Now you see her again in the expanded universe, and you see her now kind of doing all the diplomacy stuff, and we get the New Republic and the like, which may or may not be better. Definitely isn't brilliant in the old expanded universe legend stuff. But I think revolutionary is about creating something that is new. It sounds trite, and this is, again, 100% not historically true in all instances, but you can't spell revolution without evolution. There has to be.
I love that.
It's about progress. It's about creating something new. And if we look at things that we think of as historic revolutions, whether they be the Industrial Revolution or the American Revolution or the Russian Revolution, all of them are about newness to varying degrees, and all of them are about or contain elements of kind of intellectual engagement with the topic. There is ideology behind revolution. The American Revolution, we hold all men to be created equal.
Yeah.
What a concept.
Yeah, right.
That had never been written down before.
Yeah.
And, the Russian Revolution, which, turns out to be pretty horrifying in its own way, but is, it's about the fact that the proletariat should have the means of their own production. The French Revolution is about the droit de l'homme, the rights of man, that, citizens have rights. They do not simply get ruled by a god king emperor. The Industrial Revolution is now actually, you can create the most amazing things that have never existed before. It's about newness. And I see that in Leia, the desire to create something that is new and better. And I see it in Nemec as well. That's this idea that it's not just about, they're going to shoot some stormtroopers. Princess Leia is going to shoot some stormtroopers in the face as part of the rebellion. But that's not necessarily the only part of the revolution. There is more to it.
Wow.
With that in mind, the idea of a revolution versus just fighting back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In the future of Star Wars, we're hearing of like Rey's, the possibility of Rey's story continuing. So when I refer to the future of Star Wars, I'm talking about within universe after Rise of Skywalker.
Yeah.
If they don't want to just reinvent the Empire as another Nazi regime, what threat to real-world democracy could they explore?
Mm-hmm.
That's a really good question. And obviously, before I say this, I'll caveat this with anybody listening, before you start tweeting stuff out, I don't know anything about the Rey film or about Starfighter or anything.
Exactly.
I'm struggling to think of anybody who is less likely to be told that by Lucasfilm than I am.
Except maybe us.
Yeah. I was about to say, maybe us.
We're not getting that exclusive.
Possibly the most ignorant people in the world about what Lucasfilm's plans for the future are.
Perfect.
Yeah. I think building is building is hard.
Mm-hmm.
I would find that really interesting. That actually, whatever it is that the galaxy is gonna look like, is that, well, we've had Old Republic and it was pretty rubbish by the end and it failed. We've had Empire, which almost universally sucked for everybody unless you happen to live next door to Palpatine. We've had the New Republic, which was all right for a period of time, and then died a death that was probably due it. We should make something new and better, and it's going to be hard because, there's a lot of people in the galaxy, and, both republics and the Empire have let them down to varying extents.
Yeah.
So actually the difficulty, the danger might be in building something that is going to work when you have all of these competing voices in the galaxy who all want something that reflects their interests, but also, don't necessarily want to be ruled by central government from Coruscant, which is not a great way to rule a massive galaxy that's enormous.
Yes.
And is made up of Republican loyalists, old Imperial holdovers, and separatists who were never particularly sold on the Republic anyway, let alone before the new one rocked up and told everybody, oh, don't worry, we're new Coke, therefore we're better. I think finding a way of maintaining peace in a big galaxy is the thing I would find most interesting. And within that lies any number of potential threats to the sanctity of peace that might require intervention.
Yeah. And it seems as though, I think one of the things I'm kind of realizing is a lot of democracies suffer from infighting and inaction.
Yeah.
And those two things, maybe not the best cinematic, like just as an elevator pitch, but worthwhile exploring that if we're going to explore what it's like to be ruled by the Empire, by Nazis, by fascism. Shouldn't we also explore the difficulty of ruling ourselves?
And you're right in the sense that there's a narrative issue in there. And it was one that I kind of was always aware of when I was writing the book, that whilst, the New Republic is always failing and is always 15 seconds away from being overthrown by another Imperial lunatic with a super weapon or a Sith Lord and the like, some of that is a narrative necessity because, you can't have a plot of, oh my God, this enormous threat has appeared. They've got a super weapon and they can shoot lightning from their hands. But good news, everybody, we formed a steering committee. And after several rounds of budget negotiations, actually, we've solved this. So, go back to your constituents and tell them to prepare for peace.
Oh my God.
Who's going to read that book? It's going to be dreadful.
Oh my God.
You have to have Han, Luke, and Leia and Chewie jump in the Falcon and go off and save it because the story requires it to happen.
It's the serial aspect of Star Wars.
Yes.
It's the Flash Gordon adventures of Star Wars.
Yes. But you're right in that democracies suffer from stasis and inertia. It's real hard to get them moving. And when you do get them moving, it's real hard to steer them and get them to stop. And both of those are problems when you're trying to deal with the big issues.
Right.
Yes. Wow. God, it's
Should
just...
we leave on some hope, Dave?
Yeah. I just feel like... I feel like we scratched the surface and there's much more to talk about.
Yeah.
of horror.
Of everything that we could. I mean, there's so many different avenues we could have taken. You really explore the cinematic and the literature and just the universe of Star Wars so thoroughly.
I do, before we get to our final question, I do want to ask, you wrote this book highlighting how political Star Wars is, not just on screen, but in the expanded universe, Disney canon, and really anywhere else where it shows up. What can you say to convince people who argue that Star Wars is only space wizards, lightsabers, and action-y fun?
Good question.
Very good question.
What does George Lucas say to these people?
Get out of my house. Probably. I'll start off. It's fine to just take enjoyment from things. Honestly, it's okay. It's fine to just take pleasure from something on a surface level of, I enjoy this, I don't need anything more from that.
Yeah.
It's absolutely fine. That isn't a problem. People can enjoy the things that they like in however they want to enjoy them. I'm absolutely fine with it. But at the same time, you can also be wrong in believing that because that's what you're taking from it, that is all that there is to it.
Right.
And when the very first thing, literally, the very first things that George Lucas ever wrote about the Star Wars, as he described it, were that the Empire is like America after the fall, after it fell to fascism, as he wrote his Vietnam War film in space, and that's a quote. It's always been there. Now, you can
Yeah.
dig in as much into it as you want, you can interact with it as much as you want, but you can't make it not so, to the extent that, and again, there's an element of, me as a historian and me as a kind of historian of war and me as a historian of media, of, I will always read into things to the nth degree, but nothing is ever just about the thing it's about. I always used to tell my students that, you know what, bring me a history book. I don't care what the history book is about. Go and find one in the library and bring it to me and tell me the title of that book and the date that that book was published, and I will tell you what it's really about. Because the context is always the text. Things are always about the period in which they're produced.
Wow,
Yes.
Star Wars is always going to be about Vietnam because that's what George Lucas is concerned about. Those books in the 1990s, whether they are overtly about it or not, are always about the end of the Cold War because that's what was going on in the 1990s. That was the world that the authors were existing in. And, I'm a Star Wars author too, and I live in the same world as the rest of you. The idea that even if I wanted to, I would be capable of disassociating myself from the world that I live in to the extent that it would not appear in the stuff that I write is impossible. And if I look at just the academic history books that I've written, so I wrote one about First World War computer games, and that came out in 2015, I think. And I wrote one about Allied relations in the First World War, and that came out in 2018. And this book came out in 2021, 2022, something like that. And okay, they're about First World War and computer games, there are Allied relations in the First World War, and they're about Star Wars. But equally, is there anything going on in the world between 2015 and 2022 that might motivate a historian to write about the portrayal of real-world events in modern media and the importance of Allied relations when fighting multinational wars? Could any of those not be about the things they're about? And that's how it works. And if it works in history books, it works in Star Wars. It just is true that Star Wars things are about more than just pew pew space lasers. And if you don't want to get into it, it's fine, but you can't just wish it away. It's not going to work.
What I love that answer. One of the things I kind of love about it is where we began with the conversation was author intent and audience intent.
Yes.
And we've come around full circle to author intent versus audience intent here at the end.
Way to make us look so good at our jobs, Chris.
God,
yeah, exactly.
What a collection of pros.
Our final question for you today is, at its heart, right now, Star Wars is about hope.
Yes.
And throughout the book, you show how real-world fascism is represented in Star Wars, which can feel somewhat overwhelming. Like, for example, I said before we started, my spring was Andor Season 1 rewatch, Mask of Fear, Andor Season 2, and while I was watching Andor Season 2, reading the history and politics of Star Wars. So it was a very much...
busy day.
Busy day.
Yes.
And quite frankly, it's overwhelming to someone like me who easily scared and was terrified by the movie The Day After in 1983.
Yeah.
But is there anything from Star Wars that can give us here in the real world hope?
Yeah, there are various things. I mean, firstly, if you look at, dictators and their merry men from history, and you look at the Galactic Empire, or you look at the First Order, they're losers.
Yeah.
Ignoring the intricacies of the war, you will struggle to find a bigger collection of absolute losers than a lot of these people. As I said, they're bad at their jobs. They're terrible, awful, dreadful people. They're deeply boring, quite a lot of them, and they're massively incompetent. They are losers, and they lose because of it. Now, that alone is cause for hope. The problematic issue is, quite a lot of awful things can happen between them being losers in power and being them and losers who lose. A variety of pretty dreadful things will happen. But generally speaking, eventually they either collapse of their own accord or people rise up and stop them. And that's a massive thing in Star Wars that, eventually you reach critical mass and the Rebel Alliance is born. Or eventually you reach critical mass and, everybody who's got a spaceship or a Volkswagen Beetle turns up in Exegol to shoot down Palpatine's pet project, because eventually people will act. And there's a lot of hope to be had in that. We also have to hope in big historical moments like, the Second World War, that people act in time to do it. And, the Nazis collapse in 1945, and it's not a moment too soon. Would have been great if it was sooner, if it was quicker. And, that's also the type of thing that people can bear in mind. And also the type of thing that we could look at in Star Wars, that, it would have been great for the Alderaanians if the Empire had been stopped at Gorman. And it would have been great for the Gormans if the Empire had been stopped at Ferrix. And it would have been great for the people of Ferrix if the Empire had been stopped at Geonosis. And you can just keep going backwards, finding all the waypoints along the way that it would have been great if this had been the thing that did the thing. But they're losers. And losers lose. And, that's look at that, again, that collection of losers on the stage at Starkiller Base in The Force Awakens, and convince me that they're not losers. Because they clearly are. And, amusingly, I'm pretty sure that Hux has been told by his father numerous times that he's a loser as well. I think it's one of the reasons why he helps bump him off.
Yes.
But that's who they are. And whilst we should treat them seriously, because they have a degree of power and, they're very clear about the awful things that they're intending to do, treat them seriously, treat the things that they say seriously, treat their intentions seriously. They mean it when they say that they're going to do these things. You can also call them losers at the same time and treat them as such.
That's amazing. Chris,
Perfect.
Thank you so much for joining us and telling us what the history of politics. Yeah, exactly. That's
I was
exactly
going to claw my webcam off the computer.
Just start burning things down.
No, this was incredible. Thank you so much for coming
pleasure.
on and talking about your work and giving us so much great nuggets to think about.
Yeah.
I've got a lot of love for history and politics as a book.
Yeah.
I can never revisit it, but I've got a lot of love for it.
Oh, you should.
You absolutely should.
I think it was a great read to read this spring. I know I made that joke about Andor and everything, but honestly, it opened. It made me realize how intricate history is within itself.
Yes.
And how one thing touches another. Like how dominoes that started falling in 1916 are still pushing things over today.
Yeah.
And so in that instance, for me, who doesn't have a great grasp on history, it was a great education. For someone who has a great grasp on Star Wars, it was a great way to understand history.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a terrific read. Where can people find you, and what should they look for the future of Dr. Chris Kemphsall?
Well, not on Twitter. Whilst I have a dormant profile there, if you're tagging me on things on Twitter, I appreciate it. Not going to do anything with that.
Yep.
I'm on Blue Sky and I'm on Instagram. As for stuff for the future, I've got an article in Star Wars Insider coming out relatively soon, which is pretty cool. If people like battle droids, you might find some fun history stuff about battle droids in there.
Chris, thank you so much.
No, thank you both for having me back for more rip-roaring, laughable fun.
Well, I hope when your next book hits shelves, you'll come back and join us again.
Yes, yeah, I would love that. I would like that very much.
I think also we'll try to think of a subject where we can just have a little bit more fun and a little less fear.
Yeah, God, there's got to be some jokes in there somewhere.
I actually found this very inspiring and uplifting. I don't know. I
did too.
I think that there's something to really take from here as to how to approach activism today and being engaged in what's happening around us today. I think it's a good call to action. Yeah.
I also really appreciate just talking about it, because I live in my head so much that I make shit up about what I think is possibly happening or whatever. And just talking to you, it's almost like an anchoring effect of okay, I understand this a little bit better. I think I can comprehend this. Feet are on the ground, hands reaching high to the stars.
There were very few people who end up more in their heads about stuff than historians. I mean, looking back at when the pandemic happened and everybody going, I'm sure this will be fine. And then everybody, like me and all of my friends who studied the Spanish flu, going, I don't think this is going to be fine. I'm very convinced this is not going to be fine.
Chris, may the force be with you.
And may the force be with both of you.
Do you have like maybe 15 more minutes?
Yeah. I'll totally go for it.
Okay, great. I forgot I hadn't asked that at the beginning of the session.
Yeah, I'm not going anywhere.
You know what? Give me your cell phone number, and anytime I have a historical question, I'm just gonna call you. You'll be like, dude, it's 3 a.m. in London. I'll be like, I don't care. It's 9 here.
Yeah, and I have a
block us on Instagram after this.
Yeah, I have a very pressing question about Bismarck.